Well, hey there, everyone. Hello, hello, hello. Hope everybody's having a great Wednesday. We are here for our monthly workshop here in the Badass Moneymakers. It is May 2021. We are doing, today we're going to be talking all about hiring and really talking about the difference between employees and independent contractors. So today's topic, hiring right, understanding the difference between independent contractors and employees and why this actually matters. I want to change up my background a little bit. I want to get more fun. Well, that's kind of nice. I like that. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and dive in. For folks who are here watching live, if you have any questions as I'm going through, please put them in the comments. If you are watching this on replay, definitely come to our monthly Q&A session so I can get those questions answered for you all. But I cannot stress enough how important this topic is, regardless of where you are in your business. Because even if you are on day one and you are paying someone to do one project, one time kind of thing, this is something you need to be aware of. Because businesses of all sizes, of all experience levels, of all number of people working for them levels, can get nabbed by this. And there are some pretty significant penalties if you do. So now that I've fully scared you and you're freaking out, and I know you'll stick around for the hour because you're terrified, let's go ahead and dive in. And I will tell you, the good news is, it's going to be okay. Once we get through this hour, you're going to feel better. And even if you've been doing it, quote unquote, wrong, it's also going to be okay. We're going to work together. We'll get this figured out. Okay. So let me go ahead and pull up my slides here and let's pop over. Cool. So today we're going to cover what an independent contractor is versus an employee. We use these terms a lot in business, but most people don't actually understand what they are, why the proper classification matters, and then other factors to consider. And so Tia says, is a freelancer the same as a contractor? Yeah, we're gonna, so let me pop this question up on the screen. So yeah, it really is. For the purposes of this conversation, it absolutely is. I think the word freelancer, in fact, I don't actually know the origin, but I think the word freelancer came about because, this industry got created of people who would do work kind of on a project basis, if you will, right? So they weren't employees, they weren't long-term, they weren't full-time, but you could hire them to write an article. You could hire them to set up a web, certain things. And so I think this term freelancer got created to just kind of explain I'm a freelance web designer, whatever it is. It became sort of like a marketing term almost, if you will. It's not a legal term in any sense. It's not a tax term. The tax term that we use is independent contractor. So yes, if you are a freelancer, then independent contractor is actually the appropriate tax term that you would use. Okay, so these are the things we're going to cover today. So let's pop in. I said this kind of a little bit when I first started out, that what I'm going to teach you today might give you a little bit of heartburn. I do not want anyone to panic. It is very possible that you are currently classifying your workers wrong. This isn't going to be true for everybody, but it's very possible that you are. One of the biggest issues, I suppose, that I see people in our space, that I see in my client pool doing is misclassifying their workers. It is widespread. So I want to be very clear, if at the end of this, you're like, oh shit, this is me, I'm doing it, you are not alone, okay? And we're going to talk about how you can kind of course correct if you are in fact doing it. So let's dive into the actual definitions. What is an independent contractor? Well, the general rule, and this comes straight from the IRS, the general rule is that an individual is an independent contractor if the payer has the right, so me, the business owner, the payer, has the right to control or direct only the result of the work and not what will be done and how it will be done. So I just want to reiterate that. So I, as a business owner, hire someone to do a job for me. That person is an independent contractor if I have the right to control or direct only the result of the work, meaning they made me a website and I loved it or I hated it and I told them to fix some things, but not what will be done and how it will be done. So I don't have the right to tell them exactly how to build that website, okay? And we're going to get into details and examples. So this is very high level. So what's an employee? Well, under common law rules, anyone, again, this is straight from the IRS, anyone who performs services for you is your employee if you can control what will be done and how it will be done. This is the key. Control is a word we're going to use a lot today. If this were a drinking game, you'd be drunk by the end of the hour if we were drinking to control, okay? Because control is the big theme here. How much control do I have as the business owner over this worker? So moving on in what the IRS says, this is so even when you give the employee freedom of action. So if you're thinking about control and you're thinking, well, I don't keep my employee tied up, and force them to do the work, that like it's not that strict, right? You can still have control even if you give them some independence, and we're going to talk about what that means. What matters is that you have the right to control the details of how the services are performed. All right. So again, we're going to get into all of this. So why does this matter? Well, independent contractors are subject to what's called self-employment taxes. You know this if you are a business owner yourself. Those get paid in through quarterly estimated tax payments and reported on your Form 1040, Schedule SE, if you want to dork out with me, filed in April of the following year. Employees are subject to payroll taxes, which basically are the equivalent of self-employment taxes. They do the same thing. They pay for Social Security and Medicare. But with employees, those payroll taxes are split between the employer and the employee. So self-employment taxes are 15.3%. If you actually split that, it's actually two parts. 7.65% is the employer portion and 7.65% is the employee portion. So with an employee, I'm about to sneeze. Hold on. Oh no. Excuse me. With an employee, the employer portion gets paid by you, the business owner, and the employee portion gets withheld from their paycheck. And then the employer takes both of those portions and pays them into the federal and state governments on a regular basis. Can be monthly, quarterly. It just depends on how much usually you have to pay. So the incentive for the employer or the business owner is to classify a worker as an independent contractor so that they don't have to worry about payroll taxes at all, right? If someone's an independent contractor, you can just cut them a check for the work that they did, and you don't have to worry about those payroll or any taxes at all. So there's a huge incentive there for the business owner to say, oh, this is an independent contractor. I didn't actually write this here on this slide, but there's also another incentive, which is that both the federal and state governments have laws around how you treat employees. How many days off you have to give them, and how often you have to pay them, and if a person's not an employee, you don't have to do any of that. So huge, huge, huge incentives for business owners to treat people as independent contractors. But here's the deal. Misclassifying your workers can potentially have huge consequences. Because if the IRS comes in and determines that you've misclassified your workers and you've called them contractors when they are in fact in their nature employees, you actually will be liable for back payroll taxes and interest and penalties. I had this happen to a client of mine. It happened well before she was my client, but she actually lost her first business because this happened. She had a bunch of people working for her. They were all contractors. She didn't know any better. She wasn't trying to skate the laws. She just didn't really understand it and didn't ask an accountant for help. And the IRS came in and she ended up having a $300,000 tax bill for all of the back payroll taxes for all of these people, plus interest, plus penalties. Huge, 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 huge consequences. Now, again, I'm not trying to scare you here. Most of us aren't going to get a $300,000 tax bill because our businesses are small enough that even if we're doing it wrong, and even if we got caught, it would be significantly lower. But this is why it's really important to understand this stuff now, and so that you can set things up correctly, or if you decide not to, at least understand the risk you're taking on, right? Okay, so the question then becomes, well, how do I figure out what my workers actually are? Now, the IRS used to have something called the 20-factor test, and it was basically 20 questions. It was kind of like, do you remember those Cosmo quizzes in the past? It's kind of like one of those. You go through all the questions, and if you got so many yes answers, they were an independent contractor versus an employee. Well, they got rid of that because what they basically said was, as the nature of work evolves, that we can't sort of pigeonhole everybody into those 20 questions. And so what they now say, and again, this is the IRS, states can have different approaches to this, although most at least start with the IRS framework. But what the IRS says is they actually look at the degree of control. Remember, I told you that word's going to keep coming back, and independence that the worker has. And they break it into three categories: behavioral, financial, and then the type of relationship. And we're going to dive into each. But ultimately, the IRS says it comes down to the facts and the circumstances of each case. Now, the good thing about that is it means that there's wiggle room. So if your situation, that was the downside of the 20-factor test, is you might get to the end and it would say employee and you'd be like, this just still doesn't feel like an employee to me. So the good thing about this situation now is it's facts and circumstances. So you can plead your case. If you can make a good case for why they're a contractor over an employee, you have a better shot of winning in theory under this new model because it's based on facts and circumstances versus these 20 questions. The downside is the IRS can do the same. If they can make a good case that the person's an employee, they have a better shot of winning as well. So really important to understand these three categories. And we're going to talk about this, I think, a little bit at the end, but what I highly recommend you do is you go through this analysis for every person or type of role you hire. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So let's talk about behavioral category. This is the first category. The question here really is, does the company control or have the right to control? Key point there. You don't necessarily have to use the control, but if you have the right to control what the worker does and how the worker does their job. Do they have the right to control how the worker does the work? Okay, so we look at this through a variety of lenses. What are the instructions given? So are you giving really detailed instructions, or are you just saying, build me a website? What is the degree of instruction? So again, are you sitting down and walking them through how to do something, or are you just saying, I would like you to make me a website, please? What about evaluation systems? Do you have processes throughout where you're doing reviews for folks, where you're saying, think back to if you were ever an employee, you would get like quarterly or annual reviews. Are you doing things like that? That tends to be more indicative of an employee. And then what about training? If you're providing training is a really good indicator that somebody's an employee. Now, it depends on what the training is. So let's just use my website example. If I hire someone to build me a website and I say, we have this 1-hour training on my brand voice. We've put it together so that every new person who comes into my business goes through this training and they understand how we speak and what words we use and what our vibe and our brand are. And I say to the website person, I'd like you to do this training. That doesn't necessarily indicate that they're an employee, because that training is providing them with valuable information that they need to go do their job. But if I say, hey, I'm going to provide you a training on how to create a website, that's a pretty good indicator that that's an employee, because that training is actually explaining to them how to do it, if that makes sense, okay? So that's what we think about when we think about behavioral. So now let's again, we're going to just keep diving in, because I find with this type of analysis, having really good examples is what helps people understand this and wrap your mind around it. So let's talk about type of instructions given. Instructions can be when and where the work is done. So if you're saying to somebody, I need you to do this, I need you to be available, Monday through Wednesday, 9 to 5. Probably more likely an employee. I need you to do this work from this location. Probably almost certainly an employee. What tools or equipment must be used? If you hire a social media manager to run your social media, and you say, okay, I want you to use Planoly, and I want you to use Canva to design the graphics, and I want you to use this and this, that could indicate that they're an employee. Now, I want to clarify, if a social media person comes in and you happen to say, hey, we have these tools in our business that we already pay for if you want to use them, and the person says, oh, great, I don't actually have, I haven't paid for that tool yet. Sure, maybe I'll use your account. Or maybe you, like, for example, in my business, we use Canva. So we don't have a social media contractor right now, but in the past when I have, I've said to them, hey, would you mind using our Canva account so that the images stay in our Canva account? And they've said, sure. I'm not requiring them to do it. It's not something that I'm providing to them because they don't have the tools to do their job. It's something I'm asking for my convenience. But again, they can say no, and they have their own tools. So you got to look at that. If you're giving them instructions on who they can hire or have them assist in the work. So, think about it this way, like a web, I'll give you a great example. I'm thinking about hiring an HR manager to help me I'm going to be hiring some employees. She has a recruiter who works for her. If I said to her, well, I don't want, you have to hire this person and this person to do this job, then that's more indicative of it being an employee, because I'm telling her exactly how she has to do her work. But she's a contractor because I'm not giving any instructions on who she has to work with or who she can't work with in that situation. Where the supplies and services should be purchased from. I mean, again, this is sort of directing those materials. So, again, web designer, if I said, well, you have to buy stock images from this, and you have to do this and this and this, I'm more indicating that the person is an employee because I have more control over what they're actually doing. What work must be performed by specific people. This is the same thing as who to hire or have assist with the work. What order or sequence the work should be done in. So again, if it's a web designer and I'm saying, there's a difference between, hey, go build me a website, and I want you to build me a website and I want you to do it in exactly this order, and I want you to start with this and then do this and then this and then this. That's probably an employee. Okay. Please post questions as you have questions. So I know we've got a few folks watching live. So the more detailed the instructions, the more control the business has. Now, as with pretty much everything in the tax world, there's no exact line. There's no way for me to say, yep, as long as you're before this line, it's a contractor, and the minute you cross this line, it's an employee. Again, it's a facts and circumstances thing, but just keep that in mind. The more instructions you give, the more likely the person is an employee. I mentioned evaluation system as one of the lenses that we look through for behavioral. So if you have an evaluation system that measures how the work is performed, this indicates an employee. If you evaluate only the end result, because with a contractor, you're allowed to evaluate the end result. You're allowed to say, I don't really like that website. I don't think you did a great job. That's okay. But if you're allowed to evaluate any of their work up to that final delivery, then they're more likely an employee versus if you only evaluate that final piece. Now, I'm not saying, this one always hangs people up a little bit. I'm not saying that if you work with, let's say somebody designs you a website and you decide to give them a review afterwards, and you sit there and say, well, they weren't very communicative during the process. And I didn't love, that X, Y, and Z happened as we were doing the work together. That doesn't mean that they're an employee because you're commenting on the process versus the end result. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is, think back to those employee performance reviews. If you have somebody working for you and you basically say, I'm going to give you a review on a quarterly basis of how your work is going, that's probably an employee. Okay. You're not going to do that with a web designer. You're not going to do that with a contractor. So another lens of behavioral was training. So if you are providing training, it's indicating that you want the work done in a specific way and points to it being an employee. Now, again, you can provide the person with information explaining what your business does and who your business is. My example of the 1-hour video on our brand voice. That's not really training. It's different if you're providing them a video on how to create website pages on your Squarespace account. That is training. And then the last, sorry, I was trying to remember my slides. I don't remember if this is the last lens or not, but financial. So are the business aspects of the workers' jobs controlled by the payer? So this is, this includes things like how the worker is paid, whether expenses are reimbursed, who provides tools and supplies. So we talked about behavioral. This is our second category, financial. And this is a big one too. And this is one where, so I think a lot of people get tripped up in behavioral. I think that's where a lot of people are, if you look at the, some of those things, I think that's where a lot of people are misclassifying their employees. Like when you look at the behavioral pieces, I think financial is a big category as well for that. And we'll talk about this in a second. But again, it's about, does the business owner control the financial aspects of the job? And we're going to dig into this in a little bit. So is the independent contractor, well, first of all, is it a significant investment? Okay, so we'll look at what that means. Are there unreimbursed expenses? So if the contractor is incurring expenses that aren't being reimbursed, more likely a contractor. Is there an opportunity for profit or loss? So is the worker, quoting a price, and depending on how quickly or slowly they do the work, they could have a profit or they could have a loss, probably a contractor, versus if they're just getting paid hourly, no matter what, probably an employee. Are there services available to the market? So again, that web designer, if I hire them to do my website, they're also available to do websites for anyone else who wants a website. So again, that helps to show that they're a contractor. Versus if I hire a VA, this comes up a lot with VAs. If I hire a VA, A full-time VA, they're not providing their services to anyone else on the market, probably an employee. And then the last one is method of payment, and we'll look at what that means. So significant investment, look, like I said earlier, there's like no hard rule with this stuff, right? But there's no specific dollar amount that determines independent contractor versus employee. But what we look at in this case is the business owner making a significant investment in the person? That's like one aspect. And then the other aspect is the independent contractor making a significant investment to do the work? Let me explain what I mean by both. Let's talk about the first scenario where the business owner is making a significant investment in the person. I mentioned that I'm about to hire 2 people, right? Well, I might be bringing on a hiring manager. That's going to be a few $1,000s. I'm investing in a payroll system. I'm investing in benefits packages. I'm setting up a 401k plan. I'm making a significant investment. I'm also, setting up training programs and things like that. Probably going to buy them some technology too, right? I'm investing significant dollar amount in those people, clearly employees. Let's take the flip side of this. So is the independent contractor investing significantly? If I hire, let's take the web designer again. Well, that web designer probably has purchased training for themselves so that they can learn how to do their work. They've probably purchased some technology, whether that may be a computer, it may be some big monitors. It could be, I don't know a lot about web design, but it could be apps or other things that they need to do that work. It could be graphic design programs. Have they made a significant investment to do their work? Clearly a contractor. Versus think about an employee. An employee doesn't get a job and go, oh, I just got this new job. Let me go buy a new computer and let me go pay for some training and let me go pay for some tools that I'm going to need. No, they expect the employer to provide that. So it's looking at is there a significant investment being made and who's making it? Now, to be very clear, a significant investment is not required for a person to be an independent contractor. There are some industries, social media is one I can think of. You don't have to pay for a lot to go do social media work, right? You don't need a lot of expensive tools, unlike an electrician who probably has to buy lots of expensive tools. So it's not required to be an independent contractor. But if the worker is making a significant investment, it can help to show that they are an independent contractor. Again, this is a completely industry dependent, my example of electrician versus social media person. So just keep that in mind. Also keep in mind that depending on the industry, a worker can have a significant investment in their tools and still be an employee. This is probably not going to come up too much for us in the online space, but this would be an example of like someone working in construction. Those people, they may have their own tools, or a chef. A chef is a great example. A chef's going to have their own chef knives. They're very fancy chef's knives, right? But they still absolutely can be an employee, even though they've personally made that investment in their chef's knives. So the next lens to look through for financial is unreimbursed expenses. So having unreimbursed expenses is more likely to indicate an independent contractor. So this would be, the web designer who pays for, well, I don't know web stuff. Let's do social media. This would be the social media person who pays for their Canvas subscription and pays for, their Planoly subscription, a schedule staff, and pay, whatever, and doesn't go to the business owner and say, please reimburse me for these. They just consider that a cost of their business. However, employees can have unreimbursed expenses too. So, employees can buy, my husband's an attorney, and when work from home happened with the pandemic, his company did actually give him a stipend to buy some stuff for the house, but he's bought some stuff beyond that. He bought a chair and, he bought, like a standing desk thing. He's bought some stuff to make himself more comfortable. His company's not reimbursing him for that, but he's still an employee. So employees can absolutely have those expenses too. So the next lens to look through is this opportunity for profit or loss. Excuse me. So if a worker has invested significantly in tools and training and they have unreimbursed expenses, they're more likely to have the ability to have a loss in the work and therefore are an independent contractor. So the example here is, hold on. Let's take that social media person. If a social media person comes to me, I wanted to do a different example. Let's take an artist. If an artist comes to me and says, a painter comes to me and says, I say, I want to hire you to paint me a painting. And they say, okay, my price is $1,000. I say, great, I'll pay you $1,000 when the painting is done. So that painter is now going to go out and they're going to buy a canvas and they're going to buy some paint and maybe some brushes and some other supplies. Well, if they end up spending, more than they had planned on spending when they quoted me $1,000, maybe the cost of paint went up. That's on them. They don't get to come back to me and say, actually, the cost of paint went up. Now it's going to be $1,200. That's just on them, and they're going to make less money as a result. Versus if I hire somebody and I say, I want you to paint me a painting and I'll pay you, $100 an hour. Well, there's less opportunity there for profit or loss for them because they know it's going to take X amount of time and they're going to make whatever that price is per hour, regardless of, and I'm providing all the supplies, regardless of kind of the cost of paint going up. So that's something you've got to think about as well. Services available to the market. I already kind of talked about this one a little bit, but if the worker can seek out other business opportunities, they are likely an independent contractor. Now, I want to put a pin in. We're going to talk about the part-time thing in a second. So just hold on right there. So I don't want people to read or to hear what I just said and think, oh, my person's part-time, so they can seek out other opportunities. So I'm good. Okay. Because we're going to talk about that. Independent contractors typically advertise and put themselves out there as a business, either through a retail location, a website, or something similar. Simply being part-time does not make someone an independent contractor. If you go through the behavioral analysis and you can control what the person does, simply making them part-time is not sufficient to make them an independent contractor, okay? It's because, again, you have to take all of these buckets, behavioral, financial, and the relationship, which we're going to talk about. You have to take all of these buckets as a whole picture. No one of these things on its own, or within the buckets, any of these lenses that we're looking at, no one of these things on its own makes them employee independent contractor. It's all of them collectively. Okay. So if on the whole, looking at all the other factors, the person's probably an employee, making them part-time does not make them an independent contractor. I just want to be very, very clear about that. We also look at, from under the financial category, the method of payment. So if we are guaranteeing a wage, like we're saying your hourly rate is X or your salary is X, that is generally indicative of an employee. An independent contractor is more likely to get a flat fee. My example of the painter saying, it's $1,000 for me to do this painting for you. I'm paying that flat fee. I'm not paying them per hour. I'm not giving them a salary. I'm paying them for that project. A VA or a social media person that we pay $25 an hour to, sorry, but that actually kind of is indicative of an employee. And this is where a lot of folks get caught, okay? Now, this can be industry dependent. So, I don't know a lot about industries outside of the online business, but if it's very normal in your industry for folks to be paid hourly, but there's no control, like you haven't really met any of those other tests, and that's just very standard for your industry, that's okay. It doesn't guarantee, again, no one of these items on its own is the determining factor, right? So if in your industry it's standard to pay by the hour, but people are still clearly contractors based on the nature of the work, then that's okay. So the last category to look at is type of relationship. Now, this is where we really dive into what is the relationship between the business owner and the worker. So are there written contracts in place? Are employee benefits offered, like vacation pay or retirement? Will the relationship continue indefinitely, or is it a project-based relationship? Is the work performed a key aspect of the business? This is another one of those things that trips up a lot of folks. So in this bucket, we're going to look at written contracts. We're going to look at employee benefits. We're going to look at the permanency of the relationship. And then we're also going to look at the importance of the services provided to the business itself. So let's talk about the written contract. Actually, it should say contracts, not contractors. Written contracts. I want to be very, very clear here. Much like part-time is not sufficient to make someone an independent contractor, stating in your contract with the person that they are an independent contractor is not sufficient to make them a contractor. Now, I want to be very clear. I still think you need to have that in your contracts if the person isn't an independent contractor. You should still have that important clause in there. But having that clause on its own does not make them a contractor. What makes them a contractor is how the parties work together. And you need to remember that if the IRS ever comes in and looks at this, they're going to look at both what you actually do in practice, but also what is outlined in your contract. So as you're writing your contract, you want to make sure that, number one, it accurately reflects what you're actually going to do in practice, but also, if the intention is for the person to be a contractor and you're going to act that way in practice, you want that to be clear in the contract between you and this worker. So you don't want to put provisions in there that allow you to control their work if the goal is for them to be an independent contractor. So make sure that the contract reflects reality, but also that it reflects what you're trying to set up. So they will look at both pieces. We look at employee benefits too. So look, if you offer benefits to the person, this is one of those things, again, I know I've been saying that no one factor is definitive, but this is one of those things that is really hard to explain away, unless like you've got a really good case on unless you sort of, everything else is really clear they're a contractor, because contractors just don't get benefits. That's not part of how we work. So you got to look at that. Okay. I think that's really important. But the lack of these benefits does not automatically make a person a contractor. So if you have workers and you're not offering benefits, that does not make them contractors automatically. It might make you someone with employees who doesn't have a good benefits plan. And we should probably talk about that. So just keep that in mind as well. Again, I see a lot of people do this. They'll hire somebody and they'll say, well, I'm just not going to offer benefits. I'm going to make them part-time. I'm not going to offer benefits so that they're a contractor. And ultimately what that person, that business owner is doing is they're just being a really shitty employer, because they're basically hiring an employee, assuming that that's in fact the nature of the work the person's doing. They're basically hiring an employee and then treating them shitty by not paying them well, not bringing them on full time, not giving them benefits. So just keep that in mind. We also look at the permanency of the relationship. This is the one that like everybody fails. People who have VAs fail this, assuming they're treating their VA like a contractor, because an employee-employer relationship is likely to continue indefinitely. Now, it doesn't mean forever, but you don't tend to hire an employee and say, this is only for 6 months. Sometimes you can. There are certainly situations where that happens, but more often than not, you're hiring someone long-term, or the goal is long-term. Whereas an independent contractor relationship is really meant to be for a set period of time. I've hired you to paint this painting. I've hired you to design this website for me. A social media person who's doing your social media posts every month for you, that's an indefinite relationship. A VA who's checking your email and setting up contracts for you, that's an indefinite relationship. And those situations tend to indicate an employee more so than a contractor. So we also then, and I think this is a really big one, because I think actually the last one, the indefinite relationship, and this one are two where, if people did this analysis, I think these two on its own are like, the other ones certainly are problematic for a lot of folks, but I think these two on its own, like, you can't talk your way out of, for a lot of people in our industry. So this one is the work provided a key portion of the business? If so, the worker is more likely an employee. Let me give you a couple of examples. Hold on. So if you run your own business, and let's say you're a photographer, and you hire an accountant, a tax preparer, to prepare your taxes. That person, I'm making some assumptions about the nature of the work they do, but that person is most likely a contractor, because doing your taxes for your photography business is not a key portion of your business. Yeah, it needs to happen. It's important. But doing that work is not allowing your business to provide, to do the work that it does, okay? But on the flip side, if you're a photographer, if you hire a second shooter to come in and help you, like at weddings and events, right? That person is providing a service that is a key portion of the business, right? They're literally providing the service that your business offers. It would be like if I hired somebody to help me prepare taxes, since I do tax prep. That person is providing a key service in my business. So if they're doing that, then they're most likely an employee. Now, when we get into, I have folks who get into this question or try to kind of debate with me this question for VAs. And VAs and social media managers by far are the two types of workers that I think, number one, are getting a lot of us, or putting a lot of us at risk, even if we don't necessarily get into trouble, putting a lot of us at risk. And also, I think are just the most likely example of where this is happening, where this misclassification is happening. So I'll get a lot of folks who say, well, my VA isn't really providing the services of the business though. Like they're not doing the work. Same thing with a social media manager, right? They're not doing the work. Yeah, but the thing is, they may not be doing the work, but the work that they're doing is part of the process of being able to deliver the work that you do. So let's take the photographer again. If the photographer hires a VA to manage the calendar and to schedule events, right? Then no, that VA is not personally taking the photos. No, they're not editing the photos or delivering the photos, but that VA is a component of the process that someone goes through when they come and hire you as their photographer. It's the same thing with the social media person. The social, in a bit of a different way, the social media person is providing the invitation to come into the sales process to work with you, right? So that's a key part of the business, bringing people in, assuming that that's what you use your social media for, but bringing people in. So you got to look at this as well. Is this service a key portion of your business? And if so, more likely an employee. Again, though, it all comes down to control, because someone could argue, well, your website's a key portion of the business, right? So this is not definitive on its own, but I think if people genuinely ask themselves this question, it might start to flip in your mind, the work this person does is actually a key portion of my business, and I need to think about that. Okay, so that's all the criteria. I know that was a lot I just threw at you, but that's all the criteria. Remember that there are these three buckets: behavioral, financial, relationship. Within the three buckets, there's a handful of lenses that we evaluate those buckets through. Everything from training to reviews, to how the person gets paid, to who pays for the materials, to what your contract says, and to the permanency of the relationship. Okay, lots of things to consider here. Here's my advice to you, to every single person watching this, is do not ignore this stuff. What I would like for you to do is to go through this analysis for every single person you hire or every different type of role. So what I mean by that is, okay, so like in my business, I do taxes, right? So if I wanted to hire a tax preparer, I would go through this analysis for the tax preparer. I'd probably determine they were an employee, but I'd go through this analysis. If I go hire another 3 tax preparers, I don't have to do the analysis again. I've already done it for that type of role, so I'm good. But if I then decide to bring on a web designer and a social media person and a client relationship person, I'm going to do this analysis for each of them. Now, this analysis does not have to take that long. You don't have to spend hours and hours on this. But what I recommend is just sitting down. You can make a Google Doc or whatever's easiest for you. Sitting down and just documenting each of these categories, and literally go through these slides and literally each question and just write a couple of sentences about or responding to that question or that prompt for the person or the role. And you're just kind of documenting everything. What's really helpful about this process is not only will it help you go through it and do the analysis and come to your conclusion, but once you've made your decision, if the IRS comes in and questions you, let's say you decide contractor and they come in and question you and say, nah, I think this is an employee, you can say, well, let me pull up my analysis that I did. And not only do you then have the information you need to defend yourself, but you can also show it to them and say, I hear what you're saying, but I went through the analysis and this is why I concluded what I concluded. Now, they may still not agree with you, but I will tell you it will help having that, because either you'll persuade them, which is very possible, you could do that, or even if you don't persuade them, even if they say, I see that you've done this analysis, but we still disagree with you, What might happen is they might say, however, you clearly did the analysis. You clearly put thought into this. You clearly were not trying to evade the rules. And they may actually waive the interest and penalties, or even just the penalties. They may not waive the interest, but they may waive the penalties. So having this analysis can be helpful to get out of that if this ever does come to a head and it becomes an issue. So there are a couple of other steps you can take, though. If you're like, oh, having heart palpitations, this still terrifies me. Can I just hire someone to tell me that I'm doing it right? And I will tell you that even if you hired me as your accountant, we're going to do this analysis together, but there's still no definitive guaranteed answer that I'm going to be able to give you. I'm not going to be able to say 100%, yeah, absolutely, this is a contractor, there's no question. Because again, it's up to the facts and circumstances, and it's up to how the IRS or the state authority interprets them. However, you can get something that's called the IRS's seal of approval, if you will. It's actually called the Determination of Worker Status. By filing Form SS8, so the full form title is Determination of Worker Status for purposes of federal employment taxes and income tax withholding. It's a very long name. So you can actually file this form, and the IRS will basically come back and say, we've determined this person as a contractor, we've determined this person as an employee. Here's the thing, you cannot use it for a proposed transaction or for hypothetical situations. You have to use it for an actual employee. Like they actually ask you for information about the person. I shouldn't have said employee, worker. They ask you for information about the worker. So keep that in mind. And you have to do this for a tax year in which the statute of limitations has not expired. So, you can't sit here and go, oh shit, like, I think I've been screwing this up for 10 years. Can I get the IRS to sign off on the last 10 years? They're not going to do that. They're only going to do it for open tax years, which is usually the last 3. By the way, just because the statute of limitations has ended for those past years does not necessarily mean you're safe. There are rules, or I should say exceptions to the statute of limitations if you do certain things like underreport income or misclassify employees. Okay, but you could submit this form to get sign off from the IRS on what this person is for the open tax years. Now excuse me. And sorry, let's just actually go back. So you submit this form, they come back, they tell you, here's what we think, and then you go from there. There is also something called the safe harbor rule, and I was alluding to this earlier when I said, please do the analysis. It's under Section 530 of the IRS tax code. I know everybody's going to rush and grab their copy of the tax code and read 530 tonight. But if you don't, I will tell you what it says. So the safe harbor provision under Section 530 basically protects you from the liability if you can show a good faith effort to comply with the law. I don't remember if I have, I was going to say, I think I have more slides on this. So what does that actually mean, a good faith effort to comply with the law? So in order to fall under the safe harbor rule, you have to satisfy all 3 requirements to receive this protection. Number 1, reasonable basis requirement. Number 2, substantive consistency. And number 3, reporting consistency. And we're going to talk about what each of these means. So the reasonable basis is basically saying you had a reasonable basis for taking the position that you took. The way you prove this, or the way you establish this, is you can show a court case or an IRS ruling. So if you can show a ruling that is similar to your facts and circumstances and say, we relied on this ruling to make our determination, that's one way. You can also look at a previous IRS audit that looked at employment taxes. So a previous IRS audit of yours that looked at employment taxes where you had similar or the same workers and that audit did not result in a reclassification of the workers. So if the IRS audited me 5 years ago and I had the same or similar workers then that I do now, and they were looking at employment taxes, this is key, they have to have looked at the employment taxes, and they said, you're good, no problems, then obviously I can rely on them. Another way to establish reasonable basis is a significant portion of your industry treats similar workers as independent contractors, and you can show evidence of this. Now, this is the one that potentially could give a free pass to a lot of us in the online business, because you may be sitting there thinking, Well, hold on. You've been talking about how VAs are probably employees this whole time, but our entire industry treats VAs like contractors, right? Or as if they're contractors. It's possible that we could get away with that. I would still say if your VA is full-time, probably an employee. But if your VA is 5 hours or 10 hours, or whatever, and again, I know I said before part-time isn't the get out of jail card, it's not, but in our industry, in the online industry, could you make the argument that VAs who work 5 or 10 hours a week are treated as contractors? Probably. Would the IRS accept it? I don't know. As far as I'm aware, no one's tried it, but that could potentially be that get out of jail free card for a lot of us. You can also show a reasonable basis by just really any other means where someone has indicated that this is the appropriate way to treat this person, such as an attorney, such as an accountant, as long as they knew the facts of your business situation. So you can't just say, well, I went to this cocktail party a few years ago and this attorney told me it was fine. The IRS is going to say, well, was this person aware of the facts of your situation? Probably not. That's not going to count. But if you say, my tax advisor and I discussed it and we did this analysis and this is the conclusion we came to, you've probably done a good job of establishing reasonable basis at that point. So the next requirement that you have to meet for the safe harbor rule is substantive consistency. So this relief is only available if you treated these workers and similar workers as independent contractors for the entirety of their service relationship with you. So what makes me laugh about this requirement is it basically says, if you're going to have done it wrong, at least have consistently done it wrong. Like, you don't actually get points in this case for having done it wrong and then done it right all of a sudden, right? So they basically want to know that if you got it wrong in the beginning, you kept doing it wrong because you believed that you were right. This is one where a lot of folks will say, well, if that's true and I'm doing it wrong right now, then shouldn't I not fix it? Because if I fix it, then I'm not going to qualify under the safe harbor. And I get it. I get that perspective. But I think what you're better off doing is, once you realize you've done it wrong, is fixing it. Knowing that everything before that point will fall under safe harbor because you were consistent in that point when it was an issue. Once you fix it, it's not an issue. So hopefully that makes sense. And then the last requirement under the to qualify under the safe harbor rule is reporting consistency. So much like the substantive consistency, you must have filed any required forms consistently, treating the person or similar workers the way that you were saying, or based on what you were saying they were. So if you were saying people were contractors, you must have filed all your federal, forms, i.e. Form 1099, consistently. Based on that classification. So again, it's about, if you did it wrong, were you at least consistent in doing it wrong because you believed you were doing it right, okay? Now, I also want to say, and we don't have time for this would be a whole other hour plus if we were going to go through this, that some states have their own rules, and some states' rules may be more stringent. California is one that is coming to mind. California has very, very strict independent contractor rules, much stricter than the federal government. It essentially resulted in a lot of contractors being bumped over to employees a couple of years ago. So if you're in California or similar states, definitely check your state laws. I will also say that a lot of states right now are reviewing their rules about this in light of what California did, but also because we have had a massive pop-up of freelancers, of workers in companies like Uber and Lyft and, what are all the food delivery ones now, that are being treated as contractors. And frankly, they're being treated pretty shittily. And a lot of, whether it's workers actually within those companies or workers' rights groups, are saying, hold it. These people don't feel like contractors. They feel like employees. Or if they're contractors, we need to get them more, basically, or whatever. So I think what you're going to see is, I think you're going to see a lot of states passing, if not more strict, at least more clear laws on who qualifies as a contractor versus an employee. So you absolutely want to check your state laws. You want to stay on top of your state laws, because this very much could be different than the federal laws. Now, what do you do if you've done it wrong? If you're like, okay, this whole hour has given me nausea, and now I'm just going to go cry because I've been doing this wrong the whole time. And let me just get to Tia's question here. So Tia asks, am I right in understanding that you don't have to file if you paid the contractor less than a certain amount? I think maybe $600 a year. That is correct. So Tia's referring to the Form 1099. You do not have to submit a Form 1099 to a contractor that you've paid if you've paid them less than $600 for the year. There are some other exceptions as well. I won't get into that. We've actually got a video on that in the membership here. But yes, you are correct. So as long as when for the reporting consistency, you would still qualify if you paid your contractors less than $600 a year, and therefore were not required to file Form 1099, as long as you didn't treat them as employees in some other way, right? So one of the other things, in fact, the IRS hasn't explicitly said this, but on your tax return, now it depends on what form you file, depending on what form your business is in, but on your tax return for your business income, there are two lines where you might put these payments. There's like a line for salaries and wages, and there's a line for contractors. There's some thought that so let's say you're treating your people as contractors. There's some thought that if you report the money you pay them on the salaries and wages line, then that alone could lead to the IRS questioning whether you've reported them consistently. So I want to make that clear as well. Like, I get clients ask me all the time, well, does it really matter where I report my business expenses on what line? And for most business expenses, it doesn't really matter. But for these, it absolutely may. So even if you're not filing that Form 1099, make sure the payments you pay to them are being reported consistent with the approach that you're taking to their classification, i.e. that they're a contractor. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so what do you do if you have done it wrong? Well, the IRS does have something that's called the Voluntary Classification Settlement Program, or VCSP. This is a voluntary program that you can basically raise your hand and say, whoops, I effed up. If you are currently treating your workers as independent contractors, but you want to reclassify them as employees and you want to receive partial relief from federal employment taxes, you can participate in this program. Now, you cannot currently be under employment tax audit. So this is one of those things where if you've been doing it really wrong for a while, don't just hide under a rock, because if you get audited, you're going to lose the opportunity to participate in this program and you're going to be in much bigger trouble. If you are approved, you will pay 10% of the employment tax liability that would have been due for the most recent tax year, and you will not be liable for interest or penalties, and you will not be subject to an employment tax audit for those workers being reclassified. So yes, you do have to pay a little bit, but it's a much better deal than if you get audited. Now, I will say, this is if you've been doing it wrong, and it's blaringly wrong, and you want to reclassify them. But maybe it's not glaringly wrong or glaringly obvious that you've been misclassifying them, and the facts are kind of wishy, and you could argue it either way, but you decide, I don't want to live in the wishy world. I want to make it super clear. I'm going to make them employees. I'm going to change some of the rules around how we actually operate, what our relationship is. When I make that transition to an employee, do I need to do this voluntary program? And the answer I would give you is it really depends. If you're comfortable living with the risk, then I think it's okay. Because if you're changing the nature of the work, if you're changing the nature of how you work with your workers, and then you're going to also, in doing that, you're also going to make them an employee, I don't think you necessarily have to do this program. Okay. This program is if you've been doing it wrong. It's glaringly obvious. It's a risk that's hanging out there. This is a way to kind of get it off your back and not have to worry about it. Hold on. thought I had, yeah, I've got a couple more slides. There you go. So what I recommend doing is, if you think maybe you're in that bucket of you're doing it glaringly wrong, is review all of your worker relationships immediately. Like let's do that. Let's plan for that over the next couple of weeks. If you determine that your independent contractors should be employees, determine what it will cost for you to make that switch and ensure that you can fit that into your budget. If not, you may need to consider reworking some things. I also recommend speaking with your workers about how that transition will go, because it's going to change stuff for them too, right? And I want to be super clear. Let's just say you pay, you pay your folks. Well, let me back up a second. When you make that transition, I would encourage you as an ethical business owner to make sure that that transition leaves your employee, your newly employee whole, that you're no worse off. Because I do know, frustratingly, employers who moved their people over as employees and reduced what they were paying them to such an extent that it really did not leave the person whole. So I would encourage you not to do that. I would also recommend, when you're going to make this transition, that you get set up on a payroll system that is going to handle the payroll tax withholdings. It's going to handle remitting them to the respective federal and state governments. It may handle registering you for federal and state with the federal and state taxing authorities as an employer. Some of them do, some of them don't, like Gusto, which is the one I use. They don't do it for you, but they give you step-by-step instructions for how to do it. But I would highly recommend getting a payroll system so that you don't have to worry about any of this stuff. And that would be really my recommendation is, do this analysis, get this analysis down. I said it before, but having it documented can be really helpful. Now, if you do this analysis and you conclude that these people should be employees and you continue to treat them as contractors, that's a risk that you're taking on. Okay, that's a liability on you and on the business. And you just need to get comfortable with that and if you're going to do that, get comfortable with the potential consequences, which could be huge. So that may be where you say, hey, maybe I'm going to do the voluntary program, or maybe I'm going to do the form where I send to the IRS to see what they say, because maybe they will agree with me that it's a contractor, or maybe they'll just confirm for me it's an employee, and then at least I'll know. Up to you. But so just think about that. All right, friends. Well, that is all I have. And actually, this is the first month this has ever happened where we just literally hit the 1 hour mark. Could not have timed it more perfectly. But I do want to leave time for questions. I know we've got a handful of folks here watching live, some folks in our Facebook group, also some folks over on YouTube, which is great. And for our members, if you didn't realize that, you actually have the ability to watch all of our, whether it's our workshops, our Q&A, our hot seats, both in the Facebook group, but also over on YouTube if you prefer it there. The videos live in both places. They live in our private Facebook group as well as on our private Facebook channel. And then of course they get added usually within 24 to 48 hours into our member portal as well. So while I'm just going to wait a few more minutes to see if there are any folks with questions, I did want to just let everyone know we've got some really exciting changes coming to the membership within the next month or so. I'm not going to spill all the beans today, but we are just completely overhauling how you will be able to interact with the content, because what we want to do is make the content as readily accessible to you as possible. We know it's not always possible for folks to show up and sit here for an hour and watch the whole thing, or especially with the Q&As and the hot seats. So we're going to be making everything much more searchable. We're going to be making it much easier for you to find answers to all of the questions that you need. It will involve a transition. We're going to be switching actually our membership portal to a different home, if you will. But we will send you all of the information on that. So don't worry, nothing for you to do right now. And we're going to be switching up a little bit our monthly activities. We're still going to have the workshop. We're still going to have Q&As. We're just going to be switching up how we do that a little bit. It's actually going to be providing you with more support, not less. So again, don't worry, you're not losing anything, but we just want to make our team more accessible and also make it much easier for y'all to get answers to your questions. Okay, great. So I am going to go ahead. I don't see any questions. I'm going to go ahead and end this session. But just a reminder, we are here next week for our Q&A, and I was actually going to pull up when that was, because I think we had to switch it around a little bit. No, I lied. It's the normal time next week. So next Wednesday, May 12th, at 12 p.m. noon Eastern time, we'll be back here for our Q&A. So if there are questions that I didn't get to today, feel free to drop them. You can put them here and I'll answer them. Next Wednesday, we'll also send around the call for questions. So, all right, friends, I hope you are having a great week and I will see you all next week. Bye.